They say that hope is a fragile thing, like a flickering candle in a dark room. I learned that all too well one cold, stormy night when everything changed. My name is Alex, and a few months ago, I found myself in the most dire of situations. It began with a routine drive back home from work. The rain was pouring down, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. My car, an old but reliable hatchback, was too small to handle the treacherous weather, but I was determined to make it home. As I navigated the winding roads, the rain intensified, and visibility dwindled. I was on the edge of my seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a massive tree fell across the road, blocking my path. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. My car skidded, and the next thing I knew, I was spinning, the world around me a whirl of rain-soaked chaos. When everything stopped, I was disoriented but thankfully unhurt, albeit shaken. I quickly assessed my surroundings and realized I was stuck on a deserted road, with the tree trapping me within my vehicle. The storm raged on, and my phone had no signal. Panic began to creep in. I honked the horn repeatedly, hoping someone would hear me, but deep down, I knew I was miles away from the nearest town, and the storm was likely driving everyone indoors. As I sat there, rain seeping into my clothes and a growing sense of helplessness enveloping me, I tried to stay calm and think rationally. I remembered my survival training from back in the day, a remnant of my high school camping trips, where we learned how to stay safe in dire situations. I glanced around for options, but the tree was too enormous to move, and I had no tools. I settled against my seat and let out a heavy sigh. Then, I noticed something, a glimmer of light in the distance. It flickered like a dying star, but amidst the storm, it brought a wave of hope. I mustered the courage to open my door against the pouring rain, stepping into a world that felt cold and alive with danger. My heart raced as I trudged through the downpour, each step heavier than the last. The light seemed to beckon me, and I was determined to uncover its source. As I approached, the wind howled ferociously around me, and the rain stung my face, but my spirits were lifted. I finally broke through the trees and discovered a small cabin, barely illuminated by a flickering lantern. It looked abandoned but had an inviting warmth about it. I knocked nervously, half expecting nobody to answer, but a moment later, the door creaked open, and a figure appeared, shrouded in shadows. Old and hunched, the man had a kind face framed by a wild mane of gray hair. His eyes sparkled with a warmth that gave me comfort despite the bizarre circumstances. "Come in, child. You look like you've battled the elements and lost," he said, his voice a soothing balm amidst my anxiety. I stepped inside, grateful for the shelter and warmth. The cabin was small yet cozy, filled with trinkets from an adventurous life. The old man introduced himself as Harold, a recluse who lived off the grid, far from the chaos of the modern world. As he handed me a towel to dry off, I caught my breath. I told him my story, how I got stuck in the storm and how I had brutalized my car in the process. He listened attentively, nodding with understanding as I recounted my ordeal. "Life has a strange way of putting us in difficult situations," he mused, taking a seat by the fireplace. "But remember, it's in those depths that we often find ourselves." I appreciated his words, but there was something else I noticed too, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. After exchanging stories, Harold got up and started making a pot of tea. I hadn't realized how thirsty I was until the smell of the warm liquid filled the room. "Tell me," he said, stirring the pot, "what do you find hope in?" It caught me off guard. I had never really thought about it that way before. Sure, I found hope in small, fleeting things, a cup of coffee, a good book, the laughter of friends, but the way he asked made me reflect deeper. I considered telling him about my dreams of traveling the world, of seeing faraway lands and meeting new people, but then something pulled at my heart. "Honestly, I think I've lost sight of what hope feels like," I admitted. "Life has felt like a series of challenges lately, work stress, broken relationships, and now this storm. I feel like I'm just surviving, not really living." A shadow crossed Harold's face, but he quickly replaced it with that warm smile. "Hope, my dear Alex, is often hidden beneath the rubble of our experiences. It's there, waiting to be discovered. Sometimes we just need to be reminded." I frowned, searching his face for understanding. "What do you mean?" He set down the tea and turned to me, his eyes serious. "In my life, I've witnessed the beauty of hope's resilience. I lost many things, people I loved, dreams I cherished, yet hope always found a way to poke through the cracks of despair. On the scariest days, it was the tiniest things, a moment of laughter, a shared silence, that pulled me back from the edge. I listened intently, absorbing every word. I realized how deeply I desired to reconnect with that feeling of hope. Harold continued, his voice almost hypnotic, "You see, the light you saw earlier was hope, guiding you here. You arrived not by mere chance, but because you needed a reminder." As the storm raged outside, and we sipped tea over conversations, it felt as though a veil was lifted. I began to share my dreams, frustrations, and the moments that once brought me joy. The room transformed into a sanctuary filled with laughter, stories, and reminders of the beauty inherent in life, even in its most challenging moments. Time slipped away unnoticed, and I was so engrossed in our dialogue that I lost track of the storm. Then, as abruptly as it started, the rain subsided, and the howling wind faded into a gentle whisper. I peered out the window, amazed to see the moonlight breaking through the clouds, illuminating the landscape in a silvery glow. "I think the storm has passed," I said, surprised at how good it felt to say. Harold smiled. "Sometimes we need to weather the storm to appreciate the calm that follows." As I prepared to leave, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I had gone from feeling trapped and defeated to finding solace in the companionship of a kind stranger. Harold walked me to the door, and before I stepped outside, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Remember this moment, Alex. Carry it with you, let it guide you back to hope whenever you need it." I nodded, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. I drove home that night with a renewed perspective, passing through patches of wet asphalt reflecting the stars. The fear and panic that had engulfed me earlier were replaced by warmth and light, more profound than I had allowed myself to feel in months. I had found hope not just in survival, but in connection, in vulnerability. So, if you're out there feeling lost, troubled by life's storms, remember there's a flickering light waiting to guide you back. Sometimes we have to take a step into the unknown to rediscover not just ourselves but the hope that has been silently waiting to guide our way. And if you ever find yourself at a dead end, stranded by circumstances, don't lose heart. Sometimes that's where the very best stories begin. I didn't think I'd ever forgive him. The man who had taken my childhood and tarnished my memories. It was a Saturday afternoon when I first set foot into that tiny, dimly lit therapy office, the smell of medicinal alcohol filling the air as I took a seat on the frayed couch. My therapist, a gentle woman with sad eyes who seemed to understand the depth of my pain, started with the usual questions about my past. I tried to shut it all down, but she persisted, encouraging me to let it all out. I felt like a deflating balloon as I recounted the events that led me there, the night I was assaulted at the age of 16. The predator was someone I had trusted, a close family friend who had always been around since my childhood. The memories hit me like waves, each more suffocating than the last. I recounted how he lured me into a false sense of security, the cruel twist of fate that turned the safest place into a nightmare. I struggled to voice the words, choking on my feelings of shame and anger. That day marked the end of my innocence, and until that moment in the therapy room, I had carried the weight of that broken trust with me everywhere. My life spiraled after the incident. I fell into depression, pushed my friends away, and developed an overwhelming fear of intimacy. I spent years in and out of therapy, struggling to reconcile who I was with who I had become. Each session felt like I was peeling back layers of trauma to reveal a dark core that I never wanted to confront. But no matter how many hours I spent entangled in my memories, forgiveness remained an elusive concept, one that I was terrified of even contemplating. On this particular afternoon, my therapist suggested an exercise, writing a letter to the person who had hurt me. At first, I laughed bitterly. "You think I'm going to write him a letter?" I spat, incredulous. "The guy who ruined my life? You're kidding, right?" But she was calm and insistent, telling me to give it a shot. The letter didn't have to be sent. Just put everything down on paper as a way to release the trapped emotions. Reluctantly, I agreed and took the notebook she handed me. As I started writing that night, my pen trembled over the page. I began listing everything I wanted to scream at him, the way I'd felt like an empty shell afterward, how my laughter turned into soft sobs whenever I was reminded of the joy I had lost. Write it out. Just let it flow. With each word, I felt a twinge of liberation. Memories came rushing in, vivid and bright, the way his laugh used to echo in family gatherings, the smell of his cologne, and the comfort I had felt in his presence. I wrote about the betrayal, how he had stolen my sense of safety, the gnawing fear in the back of my mind that never left. I poured out my heart until the tears turned the ink to smudges, the anger morphing into sadness. And then, unexpectedly, I paused. As dark thoughts loomed over me, a new sentiment began to rise from the ashes of my anger, empathy. I began to wonder about his life, the circumstances surrounding him that would drive someone to cause such cruelty. It didn't erase my pain, but it allowed me to understand that maybe he had been broken too. I didn't excuse his actions, I still despised him for what he did, but that moment of clarity opened a door I never expected. By the time I put the pen down, I felt exhausted but strangely lighter. Over the following weeks, I revisited the letter, adding more thoughts and closing the distance between my heart and my past. It was during a particularly vivid session with my therapist when I realized forgiveness wasn't solely about him, it was also a gift I had to give myself. Withholding forgiveness had been like carrying heavy chains while trying to climb a mountain. The anger felt powerful, but in truth, it was shackling me. I decided to take a trip back to the town I had fled from after the incident, something I had thought impossible just a few months prior. As I drove down familiar streets, dread washed over me, but I pressed on, determined. Coming to a stop outside the small house where he lived, now vacant and fading from time, I felt an odd mix of rage and sadness. In that moment, the weight of past torment seemed to slowly lift. I took a deep breath, feeling the wounds throb but also start to heal. I crumpled the letter I had written, my promises of forgiveness, and tossed it into a small fire pit behind the house where grass grew wildly, an unlikely haunt of my childhood. Watching the flames engulf my words, I whispered the name of the man who had hurt me, the name that had been a ghost haunting the corners of my mind for so long. The smoke curled into the air, carrying with it all the anger, sadness, and betrayal I had held tightly. Standing there, in that moment of release, I finally felt hope replacing anxiety. The journey wasn't over, the scars would always be there, but I understood now that forgiveness was not a favor to him. It was a way for me to reclaim my own life. I walked away, determined to learn to love again, and this time for real. For the first time in years, when I thought of him, the fury that once consumed me was replaced by indifference. In letting go, I found a surprising sense of peace. I allowed myself to believe in a future where joy was possible once more. Maybe I would love and laugh again. Maybe there was beauty yet to be found after the darkness. And maybe, just maybe, I was stronger than I had ever known. I stumbled upon an old journal yesterday that belonged to my childhood best friend, Sarah. It's been over a decade since I last saw her, and flipping through those yellowed pages unlocked something I thought I had buried deep, a mix of nostalgia and sorrow that overwhelmed me. Sarah and I had been inseparable ever since kindergarten, sharing secrets like they were candy, whispering dreams of the future under the starlit sky, and getting into all sorts of innocent mischief. Our bond was a tapestry woven with laughter and late-night adventures until one fateful day when she just vanished. No warning, no goodbye. One day, she was there, and the next, it was like she had evaporated. Her family had moved away overnight, and it was years before I finally learned they had left town in a hurry. I remember the endless summer of searching, the vacant spaces in my heart as I held onto her fading memory. Thankfully, we had our journal, our shared chronicle of friendship. As a kid, Sarah and I would fill its pages with drawings, doodled notes, funny stories, and even the occasional big secret we swore to keep forever. Flipping through it yesterday was like being open to a time capsule, each entry flung me back into our innocent past. There was a note where she wrote about a tree in her backyard, our secret meeting spot where we would retreat from the world. A line in her shaky handwriting caught my eye: "If we ever get lost, let's meet here. I can hear our laughter from far away." It hit me like a stone to the chest, her laughter echoing in memories long silenced. I held onto the journal tightly as if it were my last link to her, a lifeline tossed into turbulent waters. I could feel a yearning in my chest, an overwhelming need to track her down, to find her again. But where do you search for someone who seemingly disappeared? After hours of research, a flicker, a single thread of hope. I discovered an online presence. She had left footprints in the digital world. Sarah had a social media account, and there was even a recent post featuring her smiling, standing beneath a familiar tree. It was the exact tree from our journal. The post looked recent. It was a picture of her beaming in the sunlight, a band of vibrant flowers across her hair. My heart raced. She was alive and well. I couldn't believe it. I sent her a message, pouring out my heart about all the memories we shared, the friendship that was abandoned but never forgotten, my hope for a reunion. Hours passed, and just as I was about to lose hope, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was her. "I've missed you," it read, along with an invitation to meet at the old tree. My heart pounded fiercely. It felt surreal, like phantoms of the past had materialized. I drove to that neighborhood, arriving back at the place that held so many threads of our childhood tapestry. The sun was beginning to set, draping everything in a warm, golden hue. I walked toward the tree, a giant oak that stood like a sentinel amidst the encroaching darkness. I stood there, my heart racing, filled with anticipation and anxiety. Would she recognize me? What if she has changed too much? My thoughts were interrupted by laughter, her laughter. It flowed through the air, lifting my spirits instantly. It was unmistakably Sarah. I turned and saw her, older but vividly the same, a piece of my past come to life. The moment our eyes locked, everything else faded. It felt like a time warp, as if the years disappeared, all that was left was the joy and love that bound us. She rushed towards me, and we embraced so tightly that it was like we were trying to fuse our two souls back into one. She was real, tangible, and more beautiful than my memories ever dared to suggest. We spent hours recounting stories and filling each other in on the lost years, the highs, and the lows. She explained why her family had left so abruptly, a sudden job transfer, a domestic upheaval, things she kept secret, trying to shield me from the pain. Time flowed like a river, sometimes gentle, sometimes roaring. And just as happiness enveloped us like a warm blanket, she shared something that shattered that momentary bliss. She had been living with a terminal illness for the past few years. It was devastating. After hearing her story, I felt torn, helpless. I had spent so much time searching for her only to discover shadowy clouds hanging over her life. I wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that she shouldn't have to endure this. But we couldn't dwell on the darkness for long. Instead, we embraced every moment, every laugh, every nostalgic secret. As daylight signaled it was time to part ways, we promised to keep in touch, to be present in each other's lives once more, no matter the circumstances. Walking away from that tree, I felt an odd mixture of hope and heartache blooming within me. We had reconnected in a way that felt almost divine, but I also felt the clock ticking down, an ominous reminder of her fragile condition. That night, I lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling of how lucky I was, and so scared. I didn't sleep much, consumed by thoughts of my friend who so bravely faced her mortality. Over the next few weeks, we met frequently, sharing moments that felt transcendent against the weight of reality. Each time we parted, my heart sank knowing she was fighting a battle so fierce. But then one evening, something unbelievable happened. I received a call from her mother. A panic gripped me as I answered. "She wants to see you," were the first words that nearly knocked the breath out of me. I rushed to her house, nearly shaking with anxiety as I knocked on the door. Her mother led me to the living room, a somber expression on her face. Sarah was there, propped up in bed, a fragile shadow of the vibrant friend I once knew. I held her hand, and we spent what felt like mere moments talking. "There's something I want to share with you," she said, her voice barely a whisper but filled with conviction. Before we lost touch, I wrote something I never got to say. It was then she revealed the journal I had found, a testament to years of friendship and dreams. Tears slipped down my cheeks as I listened to her words, long unspoken feelings that were raw and real. It struck me, this powerful bond we shared knew no boundaries, not even time or sickness. And so we vowed, as the days grew shorter and the nights emerged with uncertainty, to cherish each moment left, to be a source of comfort and strength for one another. The last page of her journal remained blank for a reason, and when the time came for her final rest, I took it upon myself to fill it with everything she had meant to me, every cherished memory and every love-filled line, ensuring she would carry with her the warmth of our friendship always. I felt as if we had traveled through time, binding the threads of our lives with every shared smile and tear. It was a heartwarming reunion that transcended mere chance. It was the universe reminding me that some souls never truly part ways. Even in the face of adversity, our friendship endured like the roots of that ancient oak, deep and unwavering, a testament that love could both heal and endure all. As I sat there beside her, I realized that some friendships, like the tree in the backyard, stay anchored in time, forever part of who we are, intertwined with the narratives of our lives. And even if that thread seemed fine, frail under the weight of reality, it would remain, like fireflies lighting the darkness of the night, illuminating, guiding, and reminding us of what truly matters in life. I wasn't expecting to find anything significant that day. It all started out like a normal Saturday, the kind where you just want to lounge around, maybe watch some movies or play video games. But when I woke up late in the afternoon, I realized I had a laundry basket full of dirty clothes that needed to be taken care of. So, begrudgingly, I hopped in my car and headed to the laundromat down the street. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 90s, with flickering fluorescent lights and oversized machines that wheezed and rattled as they worked. As I loaded my clothes into the washer, I noticed a woman sitting in the corner, hunched over a stack of papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. I'd seen her around. She came in often, always with that same intense look. I judged her silently, thinking, what could be so difficult about doing laundry? But she caught me staring and offered a thin smile, a gesture I quickly returned, albeit awkwardly. When my machine was full, I sat down at the row of seats opposite her, waiting for the cycle to finish. As I scrolled through my phone, I couldn't help but take glances at her. A few minutes later, she suddenly slammed her papers onto the table with a frustrated sigh, and I was jolted from my distraction. I could see now that the papers were filled with sketches and notes, some sort of project that was clearly stressing her out. I felt a twinge of sympathy, so I dared to ask, "Is everything okay?" She looked up at me, surprised, her blue eyes cutting through the dim light of the laundromat. "It's just this presentation for work. I'm an architect, trying to design a community center, but every idea I sketch isn't translating the way I want." I nodded, not really knowing what to say. I had no artistic skills whatsoever and couldn't fathom the level of work that went into something like that. "Why not just take a break?" I suggested half-heartedly, not thinking it would mean much. But her response took me off guard. "If I take a break, it feels like I'm giving up. You know how hard it is to be taken seriously in my field? There's no room for weakness." I started to respond, but instead, I found myself staring at her sketches, the lines flowing but imprecise, the vision blurring before me, much like her expression. At that moment, something clicked in my mind. I had been feeling lost in my own life, stuck in a job I hated, going through the motions without a clear direction. This woman's struggle was like a mirror that reflected my own. I decided to be more open. "I get that pressure. I'm just a graphic designer, but I feel like everything I create never lives up to my expectations either." This moved her, and she leaned forward a little, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "Really? That's kind of surprising. I mean, artistry is subjective. Isn't it easier to just create because it makes you happy?" I chuckled, almost a scoff. "You'd think, but it's hard when you're constantly comparing yourself to others. Social media is the worst for that. Seeing other designers' perfect work all the time makes you feel inadequate." She smirked. "Welcome to the world of architecture. It's like everyone thinks they're an expert when they see a finished building. They forget that it came from flaws, late nights, and complete breakdowns." We both chuckled at that, as a sense of understanding passed between us. Her humor was infectious, and for the first time that day, I felt like I might not be alone in my feelings of inadequacy. As our conversation continued, she shared how she found herself overthinking everything, how she had taken years to learn to trust her instincts. "It's hard, but I've learned that every setback is a chance to reassess," she said. "Sometimes, the best ideas come from mistakes." I absorbed her words, as they resonated deep within me. I realized then how much I had been holding myself back, how fear of failure had paralyzed my own creativity. Just as I was starting to feel inspired, the washing machine beeped, interrupting our moment. I rushed to transfer my clothes to the dryer while she prepared to leave. Just before she walked out, she paused, looking back at me. "Remember, it's not about perfection. It's about progress. Don't let comparison steal your joy." And with that, she disappeared through the laundromat's door. I stood there, stunned as I felt her words sink deep into my bones. I finished my laundry, feeling lighter somehow, almost renewed. On my drive home, I suddenly had a rush of ideas for my own work, things I had buried under self-doubt. I pulled out my sketchbook and started drafting designs on the side of the road, the urge to create overtaking me. I spent the next few days pouring myself into projects, no longer tethered by the need for validation. It felt liberating. Then, about a week later, I returned to the laundromat, hoping to see her again. I wanted to thank her, share my progress. Everything had changed because of that moment we shared. Yet, when I arrived, the seats were empty, and she was nowhere to be found. I asked the older attendant if she had seen the woman, and with a puzzled frown, he shook his head. "Not around here, kid. I don't remember anyone like that." Confused and disappointed, I left, feeling like I had been chasing a ghost. Weeks passed, and I continued to refine my work, slowly gaining confidence. I even took part in a local art show, where I displayed the work that had been inspired by that chance encounter. The community center project I created took home the prize for innovation, and I felt pride swell inside me. I always wondered about that woman, wondered if she was real or a figment of my imagination. Then one evening, out of the blue, while I was scrolling through social media, I found an article featuring an upcoming community center project. The picture was of her drawings, the very same sketches I had seen that day at the laundromat. The headline read, "Local architect overcomes self-doubt to inspire community designs." I felt my heart race. The article featured her story, detailing her struggles, her journey of failure, but ultimately triumph. I was ecstatic for her success but utterly confused about the nature of our encounter. I read the piece several times, trying to piece everything together, feeling like I was in some parallel universe. After finishing, I thought about how much I needed that conversation, how it had propelled both of us in different ways. It reminded me that life lessons often come when you least expect them, from people you might never see again. I don't know if I'll ever cross paths with her again, but I'm thankful for the moment in that dimly lit laundromat. It was there, surrounded by the mundane, that I encountered the extraordinary truth that failure doesn't define us, it's the courage to keep going that ultimately shapes our path. So, if you ever find yourself feeling lost, remember, inspiration can be found in the most unexpected places. Even if it's a laundromat on a nondescript Saturday afternoon. The time I tried to be a hero and it backfired. The time I tried to be a hero and it backfired. When I say I tried to be a hero, I don't mean the superhero, save the world type. I'm just your average person, someone who gets freaked out if I hear footsteps behind me in a dark alley or see a shadow move where it shouldn't. But that one night, I guess I wanted to step up, prove to myself that I wasn't some coward. It started as a regular Tuesday evening. I'd just gotten out of work and was taking the long way home to clear my head. I work at this tiny, dead-end office that feels more like a dungeon than a job, and I'd been wanting to shake up my life, do something that made me feel, I don't know, alive? So there I was, walking through the park, thinking about everything wrong with my life when I heard a faint scream echoing from a distance. At first, I tried to ignore it. Screams can be anything, right? Maybe someone saw a rat, or it was a couple messing around. But then I heard it again, sharper, filled with unmistakable fear, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should have just kept walking, called the cops, or even run in the opposite direction, but something inside me stirred. I wanted to help, to feel like I mattered, like I could be the one to make a difference, just this once. I followed the sound, my heart pounding harder with each step, and found myself weaving through the trees, each step crunching the gravel beneath me like an alarm telling me to turn back. It was dark, the kind of darkness that presses in on you, and the park lights barely reached the spot where the scream had come from. As I got closer, I spotted a figure, no, two figures, struggling in the shadows near the edge of a secluded path. I could barely make out what was happening, but it looked like someone was trying to pull away from the grip of a much larger man. Instinct kicked in, and before I could even think about the consequences, I shouted, "Hey! Let her go!" The man's head snapped in my direction, and the look he gave me froze me in place. His eyes were wild, filled with something dark, something dangerous, and for a second, I regretted every decision that had led me here. But then, the woman screamed again, desperate, pleading, and I couldn't just stand there like a deer in headlights. I lunged forward, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a broken tree branch lying on the ground, and swung it at him. My aim was off, and he barely stumbled, but it was enough to get him to let go of her for a split second. She took off running, and for a moment, I felt this surge of triumph, like I was really making a difference. I'd actually saved someone. But that feeling was short-lived. Before I knew it, the guy turned his attention on me, and he was fast. Faster than I'd anticipated. He grabbed me by the collar and slammed me against the tree with a force that made my vision blur. You just had to play the hero, didn't you? He sneered, his voice low and filled with venom. I tried to struggle, but he had me pinned, his grip like iron, and I realized just how powerless I was in that moment. The adrenaline that had pushed me to act had vanished, leaving me with nothing but a sickening fear clawing at my insides. He leaned in close, his face barely inches from mine, and I could feel his hot, rancid breath against my cheek. You should have walked away, he hissed, and I knew then that I was in real trouble. Panic took over, and I tried to fight, kicking, thrashing, doing anything to break free, but it was useless. He was too strong, too determined to make me pay for interfering. And then, just as I thought it was over, something strange happened. He released me. Just let go, like he'd lost interest. I stumbled back, gasping, clutching at my chest as I watched him walk away without another word. Relief flooded over me, mixed with confusion, but I wasn't about to question it. I turned and bolted, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. When I got home, I locked every door and window, telling myself I'd dodged a bullet. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd never see him again, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. For days, I felt like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows lurking where they shouldn't be. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia, maybe I was just shaken up. But then I started finding things out of place around my apartment. Small things at first, like my keys being somewhere I knew I hadn't left them or the front door being unlocked when I was sure I'd bolted it. One night, I even heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease kept growing, gnawing at me. And then, one night, I woke up to find a message scrawled on my bathroom mirror in what looked like red lipstick: "You should have stayed out of it." My blood ran cold. I knew it had to be him, the man from the park, but how had he gotten into my apartment? The locks were still in place, the windows sealed tight. I called the police, but they didn't find any signs of forced entry and dismissed it as a prank. I tried to convince myself they were right, that it was all in my head, but the fear wouldn't go away. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of someone breathing right next to me. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear, and I forced myself to open my eyes, praying it was just a nightmare. But it wasn't. There he was, standing at the foot of my bed, staring down at me with that same twisted look in his eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was trapped in my own body, forced to watch as he leaned closer, a sick smile spreading across his face. "You thought you could play hero," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "But heroes always pay the price." Then he was gone, just like that, leaving me alone in the dark, trembling, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at the spot where he'd been, too afraid to move. All I know is that something in me snapped that night. I couldn't keep living like this, in constant fear, waiting for him to come back. I decided to confront him, to put an end to this once and for all. I started searching the city, going back to the park, retracing my steps, hoping to find some clue, anything that could lead me to him. Days turned into weeks, and every night, I'd return home exhausted, only to find more signs that he'd been there. More messages on the mirror, my belongings rearranged, my nightmares bleeding into reality. I became obsessed, barely sleeping, barely eating, just driven by this need to make him stop, to get my life back. And then, one night, I found him. Or rather, he found me. I was walking down an empty street, my senses on high alert, when I felt a presence behind me. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was him. "You're really making this too easy," he said, his voice sending chills down my spine. I spun around, fists clenched, ready to fight, but he just laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed down the street. "You should have left it alone," he said, his eyes gleaming with something sinister. "But you wanted to be a hero. Now you get to live with the consequences." And just like that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing there, shaking, defeated. I went home that night, feeling more helpless than ever, realizing that he was right. I had tried to be a hero, tried to make a difference, and now I was paying the price. My life would never be the same. It was a rainy Thursday when I stumbled across an old, weathered notebook in the back of my closet. I don't remember where it came from, but the moment I opened it, I felt that familiar shiver trail down my spine. The pages, yellowed with time, were filled with notes and entries from someone who had poured their soul onto the paper. The words were messy, frantic, filled with an inexplicable blend of despair and hope. The first entry caught my eye. I found joy in helping others, but it comes at a cost. I flipped through more pages, each one detailing eerie encounters with people in need, like the time the writer found a homeless man eating scraps from a dumpster and decided to give him his lunch, a gesture that spiraled into something dark and unsettling. The narrative woven through the notebook suggested that every act of kindness led to a profound shift in reality, blurring the line between benevolence and something sinister. I helped him, and in return, I lost a part of myself, he had written. As I continued reading, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story. The writer described how every time they lent a hand, to a child, a widow, an abandoned pet, something inexplicable happened. They became more detached from their own feelings and experiences, as if helping others drained their essence like the lifeblood of an unsuspecting victim. In a twisted way, it felt exhilarating. I could relate. I had always found solace in helping others, in the idea that my actions could spark joy in someone else's life, but I had never felt the intensity of those encounters as described in the notebook. After hours of reading, my head spun with excitement and dread. I had to try it for myself. I decided to spend a week focusing solely on helping others, giving my time and energy to those in need, believing that perhaps I could find joy just as the writer did. I kicked off my quest that very Friday by volunteering at a local soup kitchen. The faces of people receiving meals were filled with gratitude, and as I slipped sandwiches into their hands, I felt a rush of warmth. I stayed late, cleaning up, chatting with volunteers, and basking in the glow of camaraderie. It felt amazing. The next day, I found myself on a park bench, watching a young woman struggle with her 2 children. Without a second thought, I approached her and offered to help, carrying her bags while she wrangled her kids. She was overwhelmed, nearly in tears, and thanked me profusely. But something uninvited stirred beneath the surface, an almost intoxicating pull, and whatever joy I felt started morphing into a creeping numbness. I brushed it aside, chalking it up to fatigue. Sunday came, and I organized a small donation drive in my neighborhood, gathering clothes and toys for those in need. When I delivered them, the grateful looks of the recipients filled me with pride, but when I got home, an oppressive silence settled over me. The joy I had expected felt hollow, as if I had been suffocated by obligation rather than buoyed by altruism. By the end of the week, I was sleep-deprived and weirdly detached. Each act of kindness seemed to consume more of my essence, leaving me disjointed and restless. I opened the notebook again, scanning for clues about what had gone wrong. There at the end, a chilling entry caught my eye. The writer explained that a price was paid for every good deed, a piece of the self, an energy that would forever be absent. I thought I was helping others, it read, but each act stole my joy and twisted it into something grotesque. I slammed the notebook shut, breathing heavily. No matter how many times I tried to grasp the joy of helping others, I could feel something darker creeping in, a shadow clinging to my thoughts. By the week's end, I was a shell of my former self. I realized that with every person I had tried to uplift, I had unknowingly made a sacrifice, not in possessions or time, but a gradual erosion of my happiness. But despite the dread in my gut, I needed to push through, to defy the impending panic. My last act of kindness was supposed to be the easiest, helping a neighbor who had just lost a family member. I brought flowers and offered to help clean. When I entered her home, the heaviness was palpable. It wasn't just grief that suffocated the air, it was something else, something dark that twisted around my heart. I sat with her on the couch, shuffling through awkward conversations, but the longer we talked, the more I felt myself slipping away. Suddenly, she confessed that her family had been haunted by something sinister, a malevolent force they couldn't shake off. My head spun, and I wanted to laugh it off, to claim it's just a figment of grief, but the way her eyes glimmered with desperation froze the words in my throat. She looked at me as if I were her last hope, and I couldn't turn away. Against my will, empathy surged. I held her hand tightly, insisting I would help her find closure. I was withdrawing from my joy, infusing it into her sadness. I could sense the darkness creeping over me as she cried out her fears. At that moment, laughter erupted from her children, breaking the tension for an instant. But I felt twisted inside. I was giving too much, and the terrible realization gnawed at me. What if this darkness was contagious? The feeling erupted into panic. I yanked my hand back and bolted out of the house, feeling utterly shattered. I collapsed onto my porch, trembling, the notebook in my hands. I could no longer deny it. A song of joy couldn't be danced to if it was laced with such darkness. As I finished realizing the toll my good intentions had taken on me, the rain began to fall again, but this time, instead of cleansing, I felt it smothering. I vowed to never touch that cursed notebook again, or help anyone in such a profound way. But as I write this, I can still hear echoes of my voice crying out for a return to joy, bumping against my ears like a haunting melody stuck on repeat. Then I close my eyes, wishing the next day would bring light instead of the ever-growing despair that shadows me now. I know I sought joy in helping others, but with the notebook beneath my bed, I find myself lost in a darkness I never anticipated, haunted by the choice to lend my hand. I still remember the chill that crept down my spine that evening, even now, writing this almost a year later. I had just finished a long day at work and was trudging my way home, my mind clouded with thoughts of deadlines and bills. It was during this mundane walk, filled with the noise of passing cars and distant chatter, that I met the old man. He was sitting on a bench in the park, a worn-out newspaper resting on his lap, though I suspect he hadn't read it for quite some time. His gray beard was scraggly, his clothes tattered but clean. I didn't intend to talk to anyone, hell, I didn't even want to talk to myself. But there was something about the way he looked up at me, piercing green eyes filled with a blend of wisdom and sorrow, that pulled me in. As I walked past, he called out, "Hey, young one, can I share a secret with you?" Honestly, I almost kept walking, but something in the urgency of his tone stopped me. I hesitated, turned around, and sat down on the edge of the bench. "You won't regret it," he said, a faint smile creeping across his weathered face. His voice was raspy, like an old vinyl record, but oddly comforting. I was curious, I had no plans but to get home, and I wanted to hear what this stranger had to say. He began recounting a story that made my heart race. "You know," he said, "life isn't exactly as it appears. A curtain separates reality from illusion." At that moment, I thought he was simply delusional, an old man with wild notions. But the way he spoke, laced with emotion and nuance, felt like a challenge. I leaned in closer. He told me about a time in his life when he'd lost his wife, how he had fallen into a deep well of despair, and how he had begun to see shadows that whispered truths about his life. Within those shadows, he continued, reside the echoes of our choices, the forks in our journey. Intrigued, I asked him what he meant, and he leaned back, his eyes narrowing as if he were tapping into a reservoir of ancient wisdom. Every decision you make sends ripples through the fabric of your reality. You might think you are walking a straight path, but there are infinite branches along the way. It only takes one conversation to change everything. He pointed in the distance, where the last rays of sunset were fighting to hang onto the horizon. "That sun is just a reflection of what you can become," he said. I wasn't sure where this was going, but I could feel a kind of electric tension building up between us. "You ever met someone who changed your life?" he asked. I shrugged, considering. In truth, I had faced a series of monotonous relationships, friendships that faded just like my unmanicured nails grow dull over time. Hearing his question made me realize I hadn't really connected with anyone in quite some time. "In a way," I replied finally, "but nothing like this." And he smiled again, that knowing smile, one that suggested there was more to what I was saying than I realized. He looked at me intently, then "Let me open your eyes." And just like that, the mood shifted. It was as if the air itself had changed, heavy with the scent of potential unknowns. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "I'm not talking about a serendipitous encounter. I'm talking about a reckoning." It sounded dramatic, a phrase out of a film, but the way he said it sent shivers through me. The other night, I made a terrible choice. There was a man who asked for help, and I turned him away. That very night, he died. I didn't know him, yet I felt his spirit tugging at me. I had a choice, and I chose indifference. My breath caught. Since then, I've spent every evening here, the guilt gnawing at me like a rat in a pantry. Then he gripped my arm, so fiercely that I could feel his weathered fingers digging into my skin. "Young one, every moment wasted is a moment gone forever." One conversation could have changed his life. It could have saved mine. I sat in stunned silence. I could hardly grasp what he was saying, the gravity of his confession was almost too much to bear. The weight of his sorrow seemed to envelop me, a powerful force that hung in the air. I thought of my own life. The missed opportunities, the people I'd brushed aside. Would someone someday sit on a bench and wait for me to wish I had said something different? After a moment of contemplation, I asked him why he was telling me this. The old man's eyes glistened as he gazed at the sunset, now dipping beneath the horizon. Because you're at a crossroads, he whispered, as if divulging a sacred secret. You have the chance to choose differently. I glanced at my watch, realizing that I was running late, that I had to get home. Suddenly, the thought of returning to my mundane routine made me feel suffocated. What if I don't? I asked, half curious, half terrified. The man smiled knowingly. Then you'll continue down a path that leads to regret, just like I did. I didn't want to be like him. Suddenly, it felt overwhelmingly important to seize that night for what it was, a nudge toward awakening. For a brief moment, I had the urge to tell him that I would change, that I would reach out to those I had neglected. And it was an odd feeling, taking responsibility for my own choices. But as those thoughts churned, the old man stood up slowly, stretching his limbs as if breaking away from a spell. Remember, he said, looking me dead in the eyes, you have no idea how far-reaching one random conversation can be. And just like that, he wandered away, fading into the darkness, leaving me alone on that bench, the city buzzing with life around me. As I sat there, a knot twisted in my stomach, I felt as if I had been handed a brush to rewrite my own narrative. Days turned into weeks, and I reflected constantly on our conversation. I began reaching out to friends I hadn't talked to in years, reconnecting with family members. I volunteered at local charity events, even helping strangers on the streets. I felt alive for the first time in what seemed like forever. Yet, just when I thought everything was settling into a brighter day, a chilling memory surfaced like a phantom. One night, while enjoying a drink in a quiet bar, I overheard a conversation filled with laughter and camaraderie. Suddenly, the last two words stood out, that man. I turned, and my heart dropped. They were talking about a tragedy that had occurred not far from the park. It was late when they output a last gasp of laughter and I heard one say, "What was his name?" That old man who always talked about choices. The words hung in the air like a cloud of dread. A chill ran through my spine when I realized I could decipher who the man was, and that conversations I wished I had saved might have been the last opportunity to alter his fate. Days later, I returned to that empty park, feeling hollow. Though I changed my life dramatically, I often wondered if my transformations were hollow echoes past the limbs of time. As I stared at the empty bench, the weight of my choices pressed down on me. I realized now, I had to do more. Conversations are not just about life, they're about depth, connections that run far beyond surface interactions. I stood up, the air heavy with unresolved futures. And as the sun dipped once more beneath the horizon, I whispered a promise, not just to myself, but to those shadows of lost moments, I would not let my chance slip again. I'm telling you all this because life is fleeting, strange, and infinitely connected through conversations, whether with old men on park benches or with someone you think you know. You never know which chat or choice could tether you to a destiny you never imagined. So please, engage deeply with life. Cherish every word, every glance. Because once they slip away, you may not have the chance to whisper a change. And believe me, your own life may be depending on it. It was a Thursday, just like any other, and the dreary rain outside seemed to seep into my bones as I arrived early to my local cafe, seeking refuge with a hot cup of coffee and my favorite seat by the window. I had moments to spare before my shift at the all-night diner. As I sipped my drink, I noticed a man sitting alone at the far end of the cafe, his head down, obscured by the shadows cast by the flickering overhead lights. His clothing was threadbare, and an unkempt beard hinted that he hadn't shaven in days, possibly longer. Something about him tugged at my thoughts, almost as if his presence was a plot twist waiting to unfold. The various patrons shifted in their seats, stealing glances but never daring to approach him, a silent pact of avoidance hovering over us like an unwanted cloud. I remember telling myself it wasn't my problem. After all, everyone had their own lives to worry about. I attempted to return to my phone, scrolling through mindless posts, yet the man's somber demeanor clawed at my conscience. Moments like these typically faded away in the mundane rhythms of life, but he seemed different. I was about to shrug it off when I noticed something odd, small, colorful pieces of paper scattered on the table in front of him. They looked like children's drawings, bright, crude shapes of suns and stick figures, each accompanied by wobbly handwriting proclaiming messages of love and friendship. Curiosity swallowed my caution, and before I knew it, I found myself rising from my seat and wandering over to him, needing answers. When I arrived, I caught his eye and offered a timid smile, but to my surprise, he looked up with wide eyes full of uncertainty, as if he had been pulled out of a deep, personal labyrinth. "What's this all about?" I asked, gesturing toward the scattered papers. His expression shifted from shock to guarded contemplation, and I began to feel that my inquiry had crossed a line. In that moment, I almost wanted to turn and leave, but something forced me to stay, a sense of duty, perhaps. "They were my daughters," he whispered, his voice fragile like glass. "She drew them before she was taken." My heart raced. "I'm so sorry," I said, and he nodded slowly, a dark wave of memories washing over his features. I felt the weight of his pain, almost suffocating. It was as if he truly existed in a different dimension, where sunlight was unfamiliar and shadows held dominion. In a matter of seconds, I had unknowingly been entangled in a web of grief. He spoke of his daughter, Lily, a vibrant little girl who loved the world and everything in it. "She always loved to draw," he continued, his voice breaking. "And she was the light of my life. Until the accident." The world outside faded, the cafe noises dwindled into a hushed backdrop, and I could see he was lost somewhere between heartache and survival. He explained how he once had everything, a family, a job, a purpose. But when Lily was gone, all that remained were memories and a haze of despair. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but who was I to intrude upon such grief? Instead, I simply listened, offering my presence, and to my astonishment, he began to open up about it all, the guilt, the regret, as if lifting the burden from his shoulders. A connection forged in shared pain became a lifeline, an unexpected bond between two strangers battling their demons silently, alone. Just as I thought an unbreakable moment had formed, a loud crash interrupted us, followed by shouts from a group of rowdy young men who had stumbled into the cafe. They were boisterous, careless, and their laughter cut through the air like a knife. I instinctively felt the tension rise but hoped they would leave after their coffee. I was wrong. One of the men, noticing the drawings scattered over the stranger's table, snickered. "What a loser," he jeered, snatching a drawing as his friends guffawed. My gut twisted in outrage. It was surreal. Here I was, captivated by this man's story only to see him tormented anew for no reason at all. I knew I had to do something, but the rational part of my mind screamed that it wasn't my fight, that it wasn't worth getting involved. But without thinking, I stepped forward. "Hey, leave him alone. You don't get to trash his stuff." To my surprise, the group fell silent, their laughter dying as they turned their eyes on me. For a moment, I questioned my sanity. I was just a waitress who had ventured far beyond her comfort zone. But something flared within me. "What's wrong with you? Can't you see he's been through enough?" In that instant, the stranger looked at me, his eyes wide with bewilderment, and I realized I was fighting not just for him, but for a glimpse of humanity in an increasingly indifferent world. The men exchanged glances, their bravado faltering under the weight of confrontation. "What are you gonna do about it, huh?" The leader of the group slurred, narrowing his gaze on me. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and the thought of backing down didn't hover even for a second. "You really want to find out?" I challenged, not even sure if I was willing to escalate further but desperate to defend a man who needed it far more than I then. Unexpectedly, the stranger stood beside me, trembling but resolute. In that moment, the room crackled with tension. I had inadvertently struck a chord, igniting a unity born of unexpected kinship. The group sneered and began to disperse, their bravado melting as they realized we weren't going to sit back quietly any longer. As they retreated, I turned to the man beside me, our eyes locking in a shared moment of triumph. "Thank you," he said, voice trembling yet powerful, echoing gratitude and a new sense of hope. We shared a quiet understanding, a bond born from a moment of bravery that neither of us had anticipated. In that dreary cafe on that unremarkable Thursday, I learned that sometimes, standing up for a stranger can lead to a connection far deeper than any initial signal of human suffering. And although I didn't know it then, this was the day our lives intertwined, setting forth ripples of change that would span far beyond our unfathomable pain. Minutes turned into hours, our conversation flowing naturally as if we had been longtime friends. We shared stories, laughter, and for the first time in years, I could see a flicker of the man he once was returning to him. That day we forged an unexpected bond that would transcend the cafe's four walls. And though I returned to my job at the diner afterward, I carried with me the energy of that moment, how a simple act of standing up could shatter the cocoon of isolation that enveloped both of us. We exchanged numbers before parting, knowing full well that our lives had somehow become entwined despite the odds. The darkness didn't vanish overnight. But from that day forward, I no longer felt the weight of the world alone. I found strength in the connections we made, knowing that even beneath the surface, we all shared the same wounds. I wish I could say that every rain-soaked Thursday thereafter brought joy, but life is never that simple. Yet the bond we formed remained, resilient even in the darkest storms. In the aftermath of loss, loneliness transformed into something beautiful, a story woven by unlikely heroes united through courage. I learned that sometimes standing up for a stranger isn't merely about the confrontation, it's about the raw humanity that emerges when we refuse to turn away. And though it started with a random act born from desperation, it evolved into a lifeline that saved us both from a place of silent suffering, proving once more that a moment's bravery can spark change that echoes through our lives forever.